The moment 6 police cruisers rolled onto my quiet suburban street with lights flashing and sirens wailing, you would have thought I was running a black market fireworks ring or harboring a fugitive. But no, according to my HOA president Karen, I was operating a biological hazard in the form of a backyard pool. I stood there, holding a half-melted margarita and a giant flamingo pool float, watching officers pour through my side gate with flashlights and gloved hands as if they were raiding a cartel compound. And in that surreal, flickering blue and red light, I realized my life had officially become a dark comedy. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was the opening shot of a full-blown neighborhood war. And honestly, if I'd known that a few thousand gallons of salt water could trigger a police standoff, I probably would have bought 2 flamingos. Looking back, I should have seen the signs the day I closed on the house in Serene Meadows, a name that, in hindsight, feels like a cruel joke or a title for a psychological thriller. The neighborhood was one of those places where the grass is a very specific shade of emerald envy. The shutters are all required to be classic charcoal, and the silence is so heavy it feels like the houses are holding their breath. I had spent 15 years grinding in a windowless office to afford this slice of the American dream, and the one thing I wanted, the one non-negotiable dream, was a pool. Not just a hole in the ground, but a sanctuary. Concrete edges, built-in spa jets, LED lighting that could turn the water the color of a Caribbean sunset, and a waterfall feature that masked the distant hum of the freeway. I did everything by the book. I'm talking 3-inch thick binders of permits, soil samples, engineering blueprints, and a landscaper who specialized in HOA-friendly designs. I had the approval stamps, I had the signatures, and I had the naive belief that if you follow the rules, the world leaves you alone. Then came the 3rd day of construction, and with it, the arrival of Karen. She didn't knock. She just appeared at the edge of my driveway like a glitch in a matrix, clutching a clipboard to her chest like it was a holy relic. She didn't offer a welcome to the neighborhood or a plate of cookies. She just stood there, her eyes narrowed like a hawk spotting a field mouse, watching the excavator dig into the dirt. "Pools bring bugs," she said, skipping the introductions entirely, her voice having that specific, nasal quality of someone who spends their weekends reading municipal codes for fun. I remember leaning on my shovel, trying to be the good neighbor, and explaining that the saltwater system actually minimizes pests and that the drainage was professionally diverted. She didn't listen. She just scribbled something on her clipboard, muttered something about neighborhood integrity, and marched off with a stride so rigid you'd think she was marching to war. And she was. By the time the concrete was poured and the tiles were set, the harassment had become a daily ritual. It started with friendly reminders tucked under my windshield wiper about the specific hours heavy machinery could operate, then escalated into official HOA violation notices that made absolutely no sense. I got cited for unauthorized soil displacement, which is just a fancy way of saying I had a pile of dirt in my own yard during a construction project. I got cited for excessive dust, then improper fencing, even though the fence was the exact model she'd approved 2 months prior. It was like she was testing the fences of my patience, looking for a weak spot, waiting for me to snap. One Saturday morning, the biological hazard narrative officially began. I woke up to find a note taped to my front door inside a Ziploc bag. Very dramatic, very CSI, claiming that strong chemical odors had been detected and that an environmental audit was pending. 2 hours later, a guy in a stained polo shirt and a beat-up minivan with no plates showed up, claiming to be an environmental consultant hired by the community. He looked less like a scientist and more like someone who'd been paid $50 and a six-pack to smell my air. When I asked for his credentials, he literally turned around and ran back to his van. I called the HOA office, and surprise, surprise, they had no record of any such audit. That was the moment I realized I wasn't dealing with a concerned neighbor. I was dealing with a woman who had confused her HOA presidency with a divine mandate. She didn't just want the pool gone. She wanted me broken. She wanted to prove that in Serene Meadows, she was the law, the jury, and the executioner. To blow off some steam, I invited a few friends over for a pool completion party. Nothing wild, just some burgers, some 80s synth pop playing at a reasonable volume, and a few neon pool noodles. We were barely an hour into the afternoon when the non-emergency police line must have started ringing off the hook. An officer showed up at my gate around 7 p.m., looking genuinely embarrassed. He told me he'd received 3 separate calls about unauthorized aquatic events and noise disturbances. He stood there, looking at my 2 friends sitting on the edge of the pool with their feet in the water, and sighed. "Ma'am," he said, "I can't even hear your music from the sidewalk. Keep doing what you're doing." I offered him a root beer. He laughed, and he left. I thought that was the end of it, the ultimate checkmate to Karen's pettiness. I thought the police telling her to buzz off would be the reality check she needed to finally go back to obsessing over the height of people's hedges. But as I floated there that night, looking up at the stars and listening to the gentle trickle of my waterfall, I didn't realize that for Karen, the police dismissal wasn't a stop sign. It was a challenge. She wasn't going to stop until she saw me in handcuffs, or until the water in my backyard was filled with dirt. A week later, I was back in the water. I had my noise-canceling headphones on, drifting on my flamingo, completely oblivious to the world outside my 10-foot privacy fence. I didn't hear the screech of tires. I didn't hear the frantic shouting at the front of the house. And I certainly didn't hear Karen screaming in her phone that there was a potential chemical spill and suspicious activity involving open water. The first thing I saw was the flash of a high-powered tactical light reflecting off the surface of the pool. I pulled my headphones off just in time to hear the back gate being kicked open and the sharp, barked orders of men who thought they were entering a disaster zone. "Hand where we can see them. Step away from the edge." I stood up, dripping wet, squinting against the glare of 6 different flashlights. "Are you kidding me?" I shouted, my voice trembling not with fear, but with a white-hot rage that had been brewing for 3 months. "It's a pool. It's just a pool." The sergeant, a grizzled guy who looked like he'd seen everything, looked at me, then looked at my flamingo float, then looked at the chemical barrels Karen had described, which were actually just large, colorful bins filled with pool noodles and inflatable beach balls. He lowered his flashlight, and for a second, the only sound was the peaceful, ironic splash of my waterfall. "Ma'am," he said, his voice dropping an octave as he realized he'd been sent to a suburban backyard to fight a beach ball. "We were told there was a hazardous spill and a potential drowning risk." I pointed toward the fence, toward the house next door, where I knew Karen was watching from behind her classic charcoal shutters. "She's insane," I whispered, my heart hammering against my ribs. "She's been doing this for months. I have every permit, every paper right inside that sliding door." The sergeant nodded to his men to stand down, but as he turned to lead them out, his eyes caught something on the top of my back fence, something small, black, and blinking. He stopped, reached up, and pulled down a high-end surveillance drone that was perched right where it could record every inch of my private backyard. He flipped it over, checked the bottom, and his face went from annoyed to dead serious. "Is this yours?" he asked. "I've never seen it in my life," I said. And that was when the front of the house erupted again. Karen, unable to contain herself, came charging through the side gate like she was storming the beaches of Normandy. "That's my drone," she screamed, her face a terrifying shade of magenta. "I have a right to document the violations. I'm the president. I have a right to see what's happening on this property." The sergeant didn't even blink. He just held the drone up and looked at her with a cold, professional stare that made the air in the yard feel 10 degrees colder. "Ma'am," he said, "you just admitted to unauthorized surveillance of private property, and you called in a false 911 report for a chemical emergency. You're going to need to come with us." The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the smell of chlorine and the sudden, sharp realization that Karen had finally stepped over a line she couldn't uncross. Her face turned the color of uncooked chicken, a pale, mottled gray-white, as she stammered about community bylaws and safety protocols. But the sergeant wasn't listening anymore. He just signaled to his partner, and right there, in front of the waterfall she complained was too loud, they led her out toward the street. I followed at a distance, still in my swimsuit, wrapped in a towel, watching as half the neighborhood emerged from their houses like survivors of storm. They watched in stunned, beautiful silence as the Queen of Serene Meadows was tucked into the back of a cruiser, not under arrest yet, but detained, her dignity crumbling with every flash of the blue lights. I tipped my margarita glass to the sky and whispered plot twist to the moon, but deep down, I knew this was just the end of the first act. The next morning, the neighborhood group chat didn't just catch fire. It turned into a localized sun. People who hadn't spoken to me in months were sending heart emojis, and someone even shared a grainy Ring camera clip of Karen's perp walk set to the tune of Bad Boys. But Karen wasn't a quitter. She was a zealot. 3 days later, while the drone investigation was still simmering at the precinct, an emergency mass email went out from the HOA board. The subject line read, Special Community Bylaw Update, Residential Water Features. It was a masterclass in passive-aggressive legalese, outlining new aesthetic standards that specifically targeted reflected light nuisances, chemical storage, and, get this, unauthorized aquatic gatherings. It even proposed retroactive enforcement, which meant they wanted me to literally unbuild the pool I'd spent my life savings on. I was sitting at my kitchen table, vibrating with a mix of exhaustion and pure, unadulterated spite, when there was a knock on my door. It wasn't Karen. It was Janet, a retired schoolteacher from 2 doors down who usually kept her head down and her roses trimmed. She marched in holding a printout of the email, shaking it like it was a cheating student's exam. This is a witch hunt. Honey, she said, her voice trembling with a fire I didn't know she had. She's using her dues to fund her vendetta, and I'm done being quiet. My husband and I looked at the fine schedule. She wants to charge you $200 a day until the pool is remediated. That's not a rule. That's an extortion racket. That was the spark. Janet didn't just bring sympathy. She brought a folder. A folder filled with years of oddities she'd noticed while living next to Karen. We spent the afternoon on my patio, the sun glinting off the water Karen hated so much, as Janet pointed out that the HOA vice president, Jeff, a man with the backbone of a chocolate eclair, was basically Karen's personal lapdog. Together, they had been steering contracts toward preferred vendors for years. But the real bombshell came when we started talking about Karen's own backyard. You know, Janet whispered, leaning in as if the hedges had ears. And in this neighborhood, they probably did. Karen always brags that her pool was grandfathered in when the 2018 regulations changed, but the people who lived there before her, they didn't have a pool. I remember them moving out in 2019. There was nothing but grass back there. My heart did a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. If Karen's pool wasn't grandfathered, it needed a permit. And if she didn't have a permit, she was doing exactly what she was trying to crucify me for. I spent the next 48 hours at the county records office, fueled by lukewarm coffee and the kind of adrenaline usually reserved for high-stakes poker players. I went through microfilms, tax assessments, and construction logs until my eyes burned. And there it was, a stop work order from 2020 for Karen's address, citing an unpermitted structure exceeding setback limits. An order that had somehow miraculously vanished from the HOA's public tracking system. But I didn't stop there. I started looking at the HOA's financial transparency reports, which are legally accessible but hidden behind layers of digital red tape. I saw charges for community greenbelt enhancement that totaled $9,000. Charges that lined up perfectly with the dates Karen had her grandfathered pool installed. I saw invoices for ornamental stone that seemed to match the exact masonry on her private patio. She wasn't just a bully, she was a thief. She was building her private paradise with the neighborhood's emerald envy, grass-cutting money. The emergency HOA meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a room that smelled like stale air freshener and repressed resentment. Karen was there, sitting at the front table, her binder of violations open like a shield. She looked older, more frantic, her eyes darting around the room as she realized the unity she usually commanded had fractured. Jeff sat beside her, sweating through his polo shirt, refusing to look anyone in the eye. When Karen stood up to read the proposed pool ban, the room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the vending machine. She started talking about uniform visual harmony and the sanctity of the Serene Meadows aesthetic, but her voice lacked its usual bite. She sounded like a queen who knew the guillotine was being sharpened in the courtyard. I waited until she was mid-sentence, talking about the dangers of unmonitored chemical runoff. Before I stood up, I didn't yell. I didn't have to. I just walked to the front and laid a stack of photocopies on the table. I think we should talk about the 2020 stop work order, Karen, I said, my voice steady, echoing in the cavernous room. And maybe we should talk about why the community paid $9,000 for greenbelt enhancements that look an awful lot like your travertine deck. The gasps in the room were audible, a collective intake of breath that felt like a vacuum. Karen's face went from magenta to a ghostly, translucent gray. She tried to speak, but only a dry, clicking sound came out. Jeff, sensing the ship was not just sinking, but exploding, literally pushed his chair back and walked toward the exit without saying a word. This isn't about my pool, I told the crowd, turning to face my neighbors. This is about a woman who used 911 as a personal weapon and our bank accounts as a personal ATM. I've already sent these records to the city attorney and the local news desk. The audit is coming, Karen, and unlike your pool, this one isn't going to be grandfathered in. The meeting dissolved into absolute chaos. Ron, the guy who always wore socks with sandals, stood up and started playing an audio recording on his phone. It was Karen, caught on his porches hidden like a month ago, telling Jeff to find them until they sell. I want that lot for my sister. I walked out of that clubhouse into the cool night air, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. I knew it wasn't over. Karen was a cornered animal, and cornered animals bite. But as I drove home, I saw the first unmarked city car pulling into the neighborhood. The Emerald Envy was about to meet the cold, hard truth. The following week felt like a slow-motion demolition of a house built on sand. The city inspectors didn't just show up. They set up shop. 2 unmarked cars and a white truck with code enforcement emblazoned on the side parked right in front of Karen's pristine driveway. And for the first time in 3 years, she didn't come out with her clipboard. She stayed behind her charcoal shutters, watching as they rolled out a measuring wheel and confirmed what I already knew. Her paradise wasn't just unpermitted. It had literally swallowed 10 feet of protected city greenbelt. She had stolen public land to give herself a better view of the sunset, and she had used our HOA dues to pay for the masonry that held it all together. The local news segment aired on a Tuesday, and it was the kind of reporting that makes you want to pop popcorn. They showed my pool, labeled fully permitted and compliant, and then panned over to Karen's backyard, which was now crisscrossed with bright orange stop work tape and a massive red tag notice stuck to her back gate. The headline read, HOA President's Private Oasis Built on Public Land and Stolen Funds. The reporter even interviewed the contractor who'd done the work, a guy who looked like he'd been waiting for years to spill the beans. She told me she'd handle the politics of the permit, he said with a jagged grin. I should have known politics meant theft. But the real chef's kiss moment came on a Thursday afternoon. I was out front, watering my hydrangeas, when a uniformed officer, the same sergeant from the night of the chemical spill, pulled up to Karen's house. This time, there were no sirens, there was no screaming. Karen stepped out of her front door, looking small. Her hair, usually sprayed into a rigid helmet, was flat, and she wore dark sunglasses as if they could hide her from the 50 sets of eyes watching from behind curtains across the street. She wasn't in handcuffs, but as she was led down her driveway toward the squad car to be formally charged with misuse of funds and filing false police reports, the neighborhood did something I'll never forget. Nobody cheered, nobody yelled. Instead, one by one, people stepped out onto their porches. Janet came out holding a glass of iced tea. Ron stood on his lawn in his infamous socks and sandals. We just stood there in a silent, collective line, a guard of honor for the end of a tyranny. Karen didn't look up once. She climbed into the back of the car, and as the engine turned over, the only sound was the peaceful, rhythmic tink-tink-tink of someone's wind chimes, a sound Karen had tried to ban just 6 months prior. Her house went on the market 3 days later. The listing was a joke, spacious yard, water feature in need of minor repairs. But we all knew the minor repairs involved a bulldozer and a 5-figure fine to restore the greenbelt. When the moving truck finally arrived, blocking the street for hours, not a single person complained about the traffic. We just watched her life being packed into cardboard boxes, wondering how someone could trade their entire reputation for 10 feet of stolen grass and a power trip. The first thing the new HOA board did, led by Clara, was to issue a formal, stamped apology to me and 3 other families Karen had been fining into submission. They wiped the slate clean, they refunded the bogus charges, and they organized a new era block party. That night, my backyard was full. We had music playing, no headphones this time, and the grill was smoking, and the pool was glowing a deep, vibrant turquoise. Kids were splashing, adults were floating on giant rubber ducks, and the air didn't smell like a biological hazard. It smelled like freedom. Janet leaned over her Floatai, clinking her glass against mine, and said, "You know, they say one person can't change a neighborhood, but I think they forgot that one person with a flamingo float and a sense of justice is a dangerous thing." I lay back on my float, drifting under the stars, listening to the laughter echoing off the concrete. It was a long, expensive, and deeply stupid war. But looking at the faces of my neighbors, really seeing them for the first time without the shadow of a clipboard hanging over us, I knew it was worth every penny. Karen tried to use the law to drown me, but she forgot one simple thing. When you try to sink someone who knows how to swim, you're the one who ends up underwater. So, I have to ask you guys, have you ever dealt with a Karen who thought the neighborhood was their personal kingdom? Did you fight back? Or did you just wait for the stop work, order of karma to finally arrive? Let's talk about the HOA horror stories in the comments. Was I too petty, or was this the poetic justice Serene Meadows deserved? Drop your thoughts below, and remember, always keep your permits in a waterproof folder, just in case.